Okay, welcome everyone. Good evening. Thanks for attending. My name is Cam Oliver. I'm the coordinator of player development, and you are currently attending Ontario Soccer's webinar on the long-term effects of heading. Joining me tonight is my colleague Miranda Wiley, the manager of player and coach development, and we're really excited to bring this discussion together on the health impacts of heading in soccer, focused specifically on research around concussions, monitoring health concerns, and strategies for managing player welfare. So we're really excited to share that this evening, Dr. Andrew Habib and Dr. Robert Gringmith are here to present. Dr. Andrew Habib is going to start on the presentation, and Dr. Robert Gringmith is going to support with some Q&A stuff at the end or jump in where needed. If they want to introduce themselves any further than that, they're welcome to now or during the presentation. But we're just going to get started with Andrew leading the 30 to 45-minute presentation, after which we'll move into a bit of a Q&A session where you're encouraged to ask questions throughout. There should be a Q&A button at the very top in the toolbar there beside chat. Feel free to ask any questions or message to try and get a group of questions together that we'll then ask Dr. Robert Gringmith and Dr. Andrew Habib after their presentation. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Habib to get us started.
Thanks, Cam. So as Cameron mentioned, my name is Dr. Andrew Habib, and just want to welcome you to this webinar. We're excited to show you guys the most recent research that's come out investigating the long-term effects of heading and some strategies that we've been putting together as an organization and looking at the research to minimize the risk of these effects. So just before we start, I'd like to introduce myself. So my name is Andrew Habib, and I am the clinic director of the Return to Play Sports Center, which is a sports injury clinic inside of the Ontario Soccer Center. We serve the soccer community with a team composed of physicians, surgeons, physiotherapists, chiropractors, massage therapists, and kinesiologists. And we focus on efficient management and treatments of sports injuries. And we do so affordably to ensure that players are able to get the best care possible and to minimize the risk of re-injury and things like that. I'm also the medical director for the OPDL, providing sideline medical coverage to all of the games that occur throughout the OPDL season. I'm a first responder, and I'm also a first aid instructor with the Red Cross, and we've been privileged to be serving the soccer community as well in this capacity to offer first aid courses that are geared towards what's commonly seen on the soccer field, and so that's been a privilege of ours as well. Dr. Gringmith is a sports specialist as well as a rehabilitation specialist. He's the director of the Sports Injury Rehabilitation Centers, which also operates out of the Ontario Soccer Center. He's also the medical director of the Provincial Excel program, working with provincial athletes and the provincial coaches to ensure the best care possible and enhance performance, as well as an assistant professor at CMCC. So just an overview of what we'll be going over today. What we'll be doing is gradually building up our knowledge together of some mechanisms and presentations of head injury so that we have a foundation to build off of. We're going to go through an introduction. We're going to look at forces that cause head injury, both direct, indirect, and other causes. We'll look at functions of the brain, and with our understanding of what the brain does, we'll be able to understand some of the short-term effects that are typically seen when we experience a head injury. And then we're going to look at the long-term effects as well as preventative measures to mitigate the risks and mitigate the effects to the best of our abilities. Now, why are we talking about this? The brain is arguably the most important organ in our body. And I recall when presenting my undergraduate thesis at U of T, clearly remembering a physician from U of T vehemently opposed to enrolling his children in any sports like American football or martial arts where the head was a target or a functional tool for performance in that sport. I remember when I first heard that, it had piqued my interest, and for a physician to have a strong stance on that, there had to be some sort of warranted concern. And so, being the most important organ in our body, damage to it can drastically influence the future of an athlete. And so, being concerned about protecting it and harms that can cause these head injuries are the reasons why we want to the best of our abilities and knowledge, learn what the effects of these head injuries are and learn how to mitigate them. So, starting off, I'd like to look at the forces that cause head injury. Now, there's three different main ways that a head injury can occur, causing brain injury. They can happen in very clear ways, but they can also be deceptive and not always obvious. Forces can travel through the brain when impacts are made to the head directly, and this would be reflected on the soccer field in the form of a ball hitting a head directly, potentially an opposing player hitting the head, whether with an elbow or a player's on the ground and then another player falls on the head. It can happen with a player falling and hitting their head directly on the ground, or a keeper diving for a ball and their head hitting a post. These would all be considered direct impact injuries that deliver sufficient force through the skull to the brain that can cause a brain injury. The next type of force, which is slightly more indirect, is the acceleration deceleration injury, which is also known as a coup contre coup. Now, what this looks like is a force traveling through the neck to the head that doesn't necessarily involve the head getting hit, but the forces traveling through the neck are sufficient enough to rattle the brain within the skull. So an example of this on the soccer field would be a torso hitting the ground, but a player guarding their head enough by activating the muscles in the neck to prevent the head from hitting the ground. They may have protected their head from hitting the ground, but that acceleration deceleration force was sufficient to cause the brain to move within. And so no direct hit to the head occurred, but the brain was able to move sufficiently within the skull to create some degree of damage. And the last most common, well, not most common, but the last type of injury is a shockwave injury, which God forbid we ever have to deal with. And this would occur from an explosion. The shockwaves of the explosion would travel through the head in the form of sound waves or forces that cause the brain to move. Now, the brain is composed of primarily fat, but also water and carbohydrates. It's a very it's a material that is capable of moving quite a bit. It's surrounded in fluid within the skull, but it can move in numerous directions. It can go vertically and it can go horizontally. It can even rotate. There's an illustration here of the ways that a brain moves within the skull. A little bit more exaggerated, but this gives us an illustration of what it looks like for the brain to move within the skull when the head moves. And there's been evidence to show that damage can occur in many different ways. It can occur through bruising from a direct impact, which produces inflammation. It can occur, damage can occur through swelling from tearing of blood vessels to the brain, and that tearing of blood vessels is one of the main concerns that we always look for after head injuries through increasing and worsening symptoms. because damaged blood vessels cause bleeds, and bleeds causing pressure on the brain within the skull. Those internal bleeds are life-threatening, and worsening symptoms are always a red flag that will require additional medical interventions. You can also have the nerve fibers stretched. Most of this type of damage is microscopic, so it's not always visible on a CT scan or imaging. Typically, when a player has symptoms that are worsening that they go to the hospital for, the imaging that they perform is to rule out a bleed. It's not necessarily to visualize damage from a concussion. So somebody who has a CT scan who has an unremarkable report does not necessarily mean that they haven't suffered a concussion. It just means that they were able to rule out the more serious risk of an internal bleed. Now, these forms of damage lead to inflammation in the brain, which can cause brain tissue loss or atrophy, and that is what we're looking at today with the short-term and particularly the long-term effects. Is what does this inflammation do to the brain, and how does it present in the long term? So to have a better understanding of what we're looking for in the short term, I want us to get an understanding of what the brain actually does. Being the most important organ in the body, it carries quite a few functions. And there are many ways that we can visualize a player having experienced a head injury on the field when they may go undetected initially. For example, this has happened many times with myself on the sideline, where a player goes down, they take a second to get up, but the referee is preoccupied with another part of the play, or something is missed, and will follow that player for a few minutes after the fall, where they may have experienced the direct or an indirect injury to the head. And following that player, you're looking for compromised function, which can appear in any one of these listed functions. And so having an understanding of what the brain does enables us to understand how these functions can be compromised when a head injury has been sustained. Looking at movement, what you might see on the field if a player has suffered a concussion, but it's gone undetected initially, you might see their coordination compromised. They might be running irregularly. Their reaction time might be slower. Landing from going up for a header might be weaker, so they might be falling. All of those things indicate that their ability to coordinate their movement has been compromised. Looking at our senses, a lot of the time when you've suffered a head injury, you become sensitive to light, sensitive to noise. So a player who's wincing every time the whistle is blown, or is covering their eyes when they're running in the direction of the sun, could be an indication that they've suffered that head injury. Emotions are a big part of function of the brain, and so a player who suffered a head injury could be more vulnerable or at risk of having mood swings or changes in their temperament. They could be more easily angered or frustrated, sensitive to their errors more than usual, or they could go in the opposite direction and become apathetic. All of those things are responsible and controlled by the brain. And so those are other ways that you can be paying attention to that. And then you have your memory, recall, body function. So a player who experiences vomiting and nausea, that is typically controlled by the brain as well. Thinking and decision making. If a player's ability to put themselves in the right position on the field is not as sharp as it usually is, their perception with passes, their through balls aren't as good as they usually are. It could be a tough game, but it could be that they've suffered a head injury. And so all of these things are potential presentations for having suffered a head injury that we can be mindful of and watching for when it's not detected right away. Now, the SCAT-6 is a sport concussion assessment tool, and on that assessment tool is a big symptom diagram that is used to evaluate what a player is experiencing after suffering a head injury that could have caused a concussion. And all of these symptoms go back to one of these functions. And so this is completely tied in. And the more that we have an understanding of what these functions are, the more we can understand, okay, this is why we are looking for these symptoms. And when we see these symptoms, we have reason to be concerned that they've suffered that injury. In compliance with Rowan's Law. So Rowan's Law is in place to protect players from returning to activity and competition prior to a full recovery from a concussion. The reason being, second impact syndrome is a very serious issue that can occur if a player sustains 2 head injuries within a period of time before they've fully recovered from the first one. And so these symptoms are what we use. And if a player is ever presenting with any of these symptoms after a head injury, that is sufficient to warrant withdrawal from the activity at the time and consult with a medical doctor or a nurse practitioner for clearance to ensure that they did not suffer a head injury, and if they did, that they go through the correct mechanisms to return to play safely. Sorry, Dr. Grimmett, did I see that? Were you looking
Yeah, I just answered that question for him,
Okay.
for the coach, yeah. He asked me about apathy, asked me what I meant, or what's apathy is the question. And I said, it's just not caring. Say, for example, if you're in a game situation, it's just not caring about the game, or not caring about perhaps winning the game or doing well as an athlete during the game.
Great, thank you. An interesting study just came out this past year that looks at the short-term effects. I'd like to share it with you guys. Coming out of the University of British Columbia, they used 8 adults and they cleared ethics to deliver a controlled amount of force to these adults who were wearing sensors all around the brain, measuring brain waves. And they delivered these forces in 2 different levels that were consistent with the forces that are received when you head the ball in a safe way. And what they actually found was that within seconds of the impact, a part of the brain was activated, producing what's known as delta power or delta waves. Now, these waves are responsible and found to be most active in human beings during sleep and when we're drowsy. And in this study, they found that these waves are activated, although intermittently for a very brief period of time. They typically will resolve within 2 seconds with these safe amounts of forces. These waves have been found to be associated with forces being delivered through the head to the brain. Now, the reason that this was a valuable finding is because when players have suffered concussions, they do experience symptoms of drowsiness. Now, when we go back to that symptom diagram, drowsiness is on there, as well as fatigue or low energy. And these are consistent with those delta waves, not feeling right, feeling in a fog. Basically, the brain is fully awake, but it's experiencing an attempt to activate these drowsy waves, um, and that is a problem for more um, physiological reasons. It actually creates what's known as plasticity in the brain, where the brain is capable of reorganizing and forming new connections. Plasticity is something that can be done positively, but it can also occur negatively. And so this connection between these waves um, being experienced after a head injury leads us to a greater understanding of what's actually happening in the brain every time that we head the ball, or every time that we experience a force to the brain that is more than it can handle. Moving into the long-term effects, a lot of research is coming out more recently to show some of the connections that we're becoming aware of. Now, Scotland is leading the way with a lot of the research, and they've come out with a great study recently in the last few years. What they did was they looked back in time at a group of researchers. So this group of researchers looked back in time at about 7,000 professional soccer players who were born before 1977. And they looked at these players, they compared these professional players to 23,000 individuals from the general population who served as controls. And they compared the mortality rates and the disease rates among these 7,000 players to the 23,000 people from the general population. They found a few interesting things. They found actually that mortality was lower in former soccer players. So their risk of death was lower. In particular, it was lower with incidence of lung cancer and ischemic heart disease. So that speaks to the cardiovascular benefits of being a soccer athlete when you compare them to the general population. However, they did find that there was a higher rate for mortality from neurodegenerative diseases. Three times higher risk in these soccer players. They found that 1.7% of them suffered from mortality from a neurodegenerative disease. Typically, Alzheimer's or Parkinson's was measured through the medications or cause of death on their death certificate, when they compared it to the population. Now, they've actually used this research to inform their policy. When Scotland saw the connection between the being a professional athlete and the higher risk for Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and mortality from these conditions, they put in place a policy to actually ban heading the ball the day before and the day after matches, and that was for the protection of their athletes. And so it is interesting to see this research coming out and how football associations are using it to shape their policy. Now, this same group of researchers actually took the same population and looked at risk for mortality from neurodegenerative diseases, but they controlled it for a few different factors, including positions on the field. They looked at length of career, and they also looked at timing of their career. So based on their date of birth, when their soccer career was, they looked at the rates of these risks and compared it among the players. What they found was that the risk was the same because they used the same population, but that the risk was much higher among outfield players compared to goalies, and that among the outfield players, that defenders had the greatest risk of suffering from one of these neurodegenerative diseases. Now, it doesn't draw the direct conclusion that heading the ball, as a defender, you're heading the ball more frequently, but our understanding of the game can lead us to make informed connections between that. Being a defender, you're typically in a position where you can be returning the ball with headers, and so that there might be a connection there. They also found that those who played longer than 15 years had a higher risk of these diseases among soccer players. And an additional piece of information that they looked at using the date of birth of these players was at what point of time, at what era were these players part of? Prior to the second half of the 20th century, the soccer ball was composed of rubber on the inside, the same way that it is today, but on the outer shell, it was composed of leather. And they found that the leather absorbing water became a problem, and created variabilities. And so in the latter half of the 20th century, the leather was replaced by a synthetic shell that didn't absorb water. They looked at the date of birth of these players, and what they found was that no matter when they were born, the risk to players who played in the area where they used the leather ball were the same as the risks for the players who competed in the area without the leather ball, with the synthetic ball. I thought that was an interesting piece of information, because, again, going back to how does this information inform our policy? How does it inform the way that we design the ball? Seeing that there was no change in the risk between that leather ball and that synthetic ball is reassuring, that the synthetic ball didn't put us at greater risk, but then it also informs us that it doesn't reduce the risk all that much. Now, one neurodegenerative disease that is getting a lot of attention, and it's primarily through American football and the research that's being done there, is chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is also known as CTE. It is a condition that is identified by a change in one of the proteins in your brain. Now, at the moment, the only way that they can confirm that these proteins have changed in the brain is through an autopsy, or actually taking slices of the brain to see that the proteins have changed. So there's no way to confirm that CTE at the moment is occurring in a player, but there are efforts and changes to our understanding of how we can potentially see this in various forms of imaging without having to wait until a player has passed away. So confirming this through autopsy, unfortunately, like, CTE can only be found in an athlete after death, but there are changes being made there. Now, these changes in protein are also seen in people who suffer from Alzheimer's disease. And so there's a lot of similarities in the presentation there. We can still see symptoms that are consistent with CTE without making a CTE diagnosis, because we need to see what's actually happening in the brain. But those that present with the symptoms that are consistent with CTE have been are identified as suffering from traumatic encephalopathy syndrome. So someone who may be suspected of having CTE after many, many years of professional American football, playing professionally as a career. If they're suspected of having CTE, they're not actually diagnosed with CTE, but they're diagnosed with TES, or traumatic encephalopathy syndrome. And those and that's typically seen with the symptoms listed. So episodic memory, and executive dysfunction, impulsivity, explosivity, emotional dysregulation, depression, anxiety, apathy, and paranoia. These are all functions of the brain, and with the damage to the brain from inflammation occurring from the impacts over time, we're able to see those symptoms presented. One recent study came out that involved soccer players. In the last 2 years, they looked at 152 athletes who unfortunately passed away before turning 30, who were suspected of suffering from some sort of change to the brain, which unfortunately led to their passing away. A vast majority of the athletes were from American football, so that is important to note that a very smaller cohort were from the soccer community, but there were athletes from the soccer community nonetheless. 61% from this study were football players, American football. 10% were from hockey, 15% were from soccer. Their brains were donated and an autopsy was performed to evaluate the presence of CTE after they had passed away. What they found was that among these players under 30, 52% of the American football players who passed away before 30 had CTE on autopsy. So it was possible to have it even starting to be visible before 30 years old. 38% of hockey players had it, and unfortunately there were 17% of soccer players who were found to have it. Now, being the small number from the full cohort, and then having that small percentage of players be found to have it is a good indication that it's a lower risk of occurring among soccer players when you compare them to American football players. But that being there, nonetheless, warrants our attention because it now introduces the possibility of our soccer athletes developing CTE on that microscopic level before even turning 30. And that would be dependent on all of those factors that we looked at, being how long their professional career was, what position they played, and so on. So now that we know that there's evidence to suggest that there are long-term risks for brain injury, how do we mitigate that risk? And Ontario Soccer has been taking initiative to provide resources to inform their policy and put together strategies to minimize that risk. This graphic was put together recently, introducing guidelines to guide our soccer community to safely introduce heading and to safely develop strategies to mitigate those risks. Now, Cameron and Miranda are actually performing or presenting on this and these guidelines and strategies on January 30th. So a date to keep in mind if anyone is interested in attending and watching that presentation. But very, very briefly, neck and core strengthening is a big part of preparing players to handle heading the ball and delivering that force through the ball safely without increasing the force through the brain that can create issues. A number of exercises can be used to strengthen the neck in a way that helps to control and stabilize the neck through the motion. And in many ways, the resistance band is one of the best ways to build strength in the neck. So whether that's putting a resistance band around the head and using that to resist lateral flexion, going forward and extending, even rotating while carrying the resistance band around the head. Those are all different ways that you can strengthen the neck muscles, as well as the deep neck flexor muscles that are responsible for stabilizing the neck as the force is being delivered. And the more stable that the neck is, the more consistently they can position themselves to absorb that impact and deliver the ball back in the direction that they were looking to send the ball in the first place. Number of core strengthening exercises are also included in this graphic. Your bridges, cobras, your planks, side plank with neck resistance is there. Putting a beanbag on the head while performing a side plank helps to develop the muscles that are on the side for lateral flexion of the neck. Numerous exercises that will be elaborated on in the next webinar for mitigating the risk of these head injuries. Now, that concludes the presentation. I'd like to send it back over to Cameron